Hi there. I just wanted to follow up quickly on my last video regarding James White's view of 1689 federalism. The last one was a brief response, showed some of the historical precedent for the idea that Old Testament saints were saved by and therefore members of the New Covenant. This one is just following up briefly on James White's own view of the matter. So I'll play a clip briefly from his debate with Greg Strawbridge about 5 years ago, where this issue came up.
So the New Covenant only includes regenerate people in your view?
Well, the New Covenant does, yes, certainly.
Okay.
There are people, there are false professors.
And is that a distinctive of the New Covenant?
I'm sorry?
That's a distinctive of the New Covenant.
That's what Hebrews chapter 8 says, yes.
Was Abraham regenerate?
Of course.
How so? He wasn't in the New Covenant.
He's in the covenant of grace.
Covenant.
I mean, this is a well-known position. We're not saying that the only people who are regenerate were in the New Covenant. There were regenerate people under the Old Covenant. The point is that those individuals who are regenerate under the Old Covenant were called the remnant. There is never a remnant of the New Covenant.
Is Abraham called the remnant in the Bible?
No, but the remnant are those people that are differentiated from those in Israel who do not have a true faith.
The remnant becomes part of the later history of Israel when various things fall away. I believe that. But what I'm saying is, if New Covenant membership, if what's new about the New Covenant is regeneration.
No, it's not. You've misunderstood our position. I'm sure you know that Reformed Baptists believe that there were regenerate people under the Old Covenant. The point was that the Old Covenant did not guarantee the regeneration of everyone that received its signs.
So in that clip, White is building off of an essay that he wrote in 2004. It was published in 2 parts, the Reformed Baptist Theological Review, links below in the description. It was titled The Newness of the New Covenant, better mediator, better sacrifice, better ministry, better hope, better promises. And it was largely a treatment of Hebrews 8, also Hebrews 7 through 10, and in defense of creedal baptism. And he wrote that from the perspective of the one covenant of grace, under multiple administrations, the idea that the Old Covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace, and that Old Testament saints are saved by the covenant of grace, but not the New Covenant. And that essay sought to answer the question, exactly what is the nature of the covenant in the blood of Christ, Luke 22:20 and Hebrews 13:20, and how does it differ from other administrations of the covenant of grace? That's the way White framed the question, and then the rest of it was his answer to it. His answer was that the difference between the old and the new is that only some members of the old covenant were saved, but all the members of the new covenant are saved. So some were saved in the old covenant, but Christ's better mediation in the new covenant guarantees that all will be saved. So here's some extended quotation of how he argued that. He says, that which the new covenant provides in perfection, the old only provided in part or in picture. Where something is found in both covenants, it will be seen to be partial and incomplete in the old, finished, total, and perfect in the new. The old covenant was, by nature, breakable. Why? Because it did not, in and of itself, affect the change in the heart and mind of each member thereof that would cause them to continue therein. While there were those who knew the Lord and followed his statutes, they were the remnant, not the norm. All those with whom he makes this covenant experience what the remnant experienced under the old. True internal conversion resulting in a love for God's law and a true relationship with him. Quite simply, there is no remnant in the new covenant, and all those with whom God makes this covenant experience its fulfillment. This is why it is better, and hence proves the author's apologetic presentation of the supremacy of Christ over the old ways. The contrast drawn here between the old faulted covenant and the new faultless one is simple. The new covenant brings salvific knowledge and relationship to all who are in it, from the least to the greatest of them. Reformed Credo Baptists have asserted that if this passage teaches that the new covenant differs from the old in the matter of the extensiveness of the work of grace in the lives of the members, i.e., the new covenant is not a mixed covenant of regenerate and unregenerate, elect and non-elect, then the most needed element of the Paedo-Baptist argument regarding the continuity of the covenants and the covenant sign is disrupted at its most vital point. The continuity of the covenant of grace is seen in the expansion of God's work of grace, so that the new covenant in the blood of the Son encompasses all of God's elect, with the older administration's ceremonies pointing forward to the perfection that would come in Christ. We must agree that considered individually, each of the elements of the new covenant listed in Hebrews 8:10 through 12 can be found in particular individuals in the old covenant. If some in the old covenant experienced these divine works of grace, but most did not, then what is to be concluded? That the newness of the new covenant is seen in the extensiveness of the expression of God's grace to all in it. We are not saying there were none who experienced God's grace under the old covenant, but that the old covenant in and of itself did not guarantee that those who partook of it were in fact heirs of grace. The newness of the new covenant in the blood of Christ is found in the reality that the better mediator, better hope, better sacrifices mean that all, from the least to the greatest of them, know the Lord savingly. This is its glory, for it reflects the power of the blood in which it is sealed. Hence, when we read God's law, the transcript of his holiness and his expectations for his people was already on the hearts of his people, and so is not new in the new covenant. We respond by saying it is not the mere existence of the gracious act of God writing his law on the heart that is new, but it is the extensiveness of that work that is new. While some in the old covenant experienced this, all in the new covenant do so. So that was summary of White's argument there, his perspective. And if you want to read that, it's on the blog as well. I'm not going to put it up here on the screen, but you can go and read through it on the blog there. And it's links to the original essays too. So we would say that while White is correct that all in the new covenant receive new hearts and the forgiveness of sins, that is, they're saved, and only some in the old covenant were saved and received new hearts and forgiveness of sins. He's ambiguous as to how that happened for Old Covenant saints. He doesn't really elaborate. Were they saved by the Old Covenant? So it's true that they were members of the Old Covenant and they were saved, but the question is, were they saved by the Old Covenant? So numerous statements in the essay from White would seem to require a denial of that, or would require one to say, no, they were not saved. Old Testament saints were not saved by the Old Covenant. So here are a few more quotes from White. The author of Hebrews' view of the new covenant as better must be seen in light of the perfection of Christ's work of mediation. Is this ministry simply of the same kind as the ministry of the old priests, only in some fashion more excellent? Or is the point of the passage that the Messiah's ministry, the covenant in his blood, and the promises upon which the covenant stands, all these things are substantially different, better than that which came before? Surely at this point there can be no argument that the betterness of the sacrifice of Christ is qualitatively superior to that of the animal sacrifices of the old covenant. His death is not just more effective or in some fashion greater than the sacrifice of a lamb or a bull. That sacrifice differs on a fundamental, foundational level. It is better by nature and definition. As a result of the permanence of his priestly position, Christ has an ability the old priest did not possess. He is able to save. Christ is the mediator of a better covenant based upon better sacrifices with a more excellent ministry based upon better promises, which include, he will assert later, the very promise of the eternal inheritance for those in the new covenant. That the old covenant had only pictured and hinted at, what the old covenant had only pictured and hinted at, but failed to produce in them, God fulfills in the better covenant with the better sacrifices and better promises and better mediator. These repetitive sacrifices of the old covenant lack the power or ability to take away sins. The text presents an apologetic argument that unlike the old covenant, where they did not continue in my covenant, the new covenant presents a perfect, full work of God, which includes the internal renovation of the heart, salvific knowledge of God, and the forgiveness of sins. We must further note that the contrast in Hebrews 10 is between, note this carefully, we must further note that the contrast in Hebrews 10 is between the repetitive sacrifices of the old covenant, which could never take away sins, and the singular sacrifice of the new, which not only can, but in reality does so for those who are in the covenant. Hebrews 10 through 18. So those are all, again, wonderful statements. highlighting the superiority, the qualitative difference between Christ's sacrifice and mediation in the New Covenant versus the sacrifice of animals and the mediation of the priests in the Old Covenant. So in light of this, I would say that there seems to be some unresolved tension in White's argument and in his perspective of the matter. So on the one hand, he argues that the new covenant is qualitatively better than the old because it does what the old could not. It gives a new heart and takes away sins. Yet on the other hand, he argues that the difference is quantitative because the old covenant did give a new heart and take away sins, just not for everyone, all of the members of the old covenant. He said, it is not the mere existence of the gracious act of God writing his law on the heart that is new, but it is the extensiveness of that work that is new. So again, on one hand, he argues that there is a qualitative difference between the new covenant and the old covenant with regards to the work of salvation and Christ's mediation. But then he argues that the difference is only quantitative, that there's just more people who are saved. The totality of those in the new covenant are saved, whereas in the old covenant, only some were saved. So I think that the logic of White's argument throughout the two essays requires him to modify or reconsider his conclusion that what's new about the new covenant is simply the extensiveness. I think what's new about the new covenant is that it saves. It's a qualitative difference. The old covenant did not save, the new covenant did. For example, if Christ's mediation of a better covenant means simply that more members of the covenant are saved, does that mean that some members of the old covenant were saved apart from Christ's mediation and his sacrifice? On the other hand, if Christ's mediation of a better covenant means Christ has the ability the old priest did not possess, meaning he was able to save, then perhaps those in the old covenant who were in fact saved were saved by Christ's better new covenant. Perhaps the newness of the new covenant is that it is able to save. As White himself says, the writer plainly sees in these words a prophetic proclamation of what Christ, the one high priest, would accomplish through his better sacrifice, so as to initiate a better covenant based upon better promises, leading to a better hope. The singular offering of Christ and the acceptance of that offering pictured in his entrance into the holy place and his being seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens, Hebrews 8:1, has made it possible for God to be merciful to the iniquities of those for whom the high priest now intercedes, Hebrews 7:24-35. In conclusion, let's just consider John Owen's comments on the same passages, Hebrews 8:6 and verse 9. Wherefore we must grant two distinct covenants, rather than a twofold administration of the same covenant merely to be intended. If reconciliation and salvation by Christ were to be obtained not only under the old covenant, but by virtue thereof, then it must be the same for substance with the new. But this is not so, for no reconciliation with God nor salvation could be obtained by virtue of the old covenant, or the administration of it, as our apostle disputes at large. Therefore I have showed in what sense the covenant of grace is called the new covenant, and this distinction and opposition. The greatest and utmost mercies that God ever intended to communicate unto the church and to bless it withal were enclosed in the new covenant. Nor does the efficacy of the mediation of Christ extend itself beyond the verge and compass thereof, for he is only the mediator and surety of this covenant. So in short, I think much of the observations that White makes on the text of Hebrews is absolutely correct. There's a qualitative difference between Christ's mediation, his sacrifice, his mediation of the new covenant. There's a qualitative difference between that and the old covenant, the types and shadows, the animal sacrifices, the work of the Levitical priesthood. That could not save. The old covenant could not save. Yes, members of the old covenant were saved. They had regenerate hearts, but it was not by virtue of the old covenant. It did not save. It could not save. That's what is new about the new covenant, is that Christ offers himself as a sacrifice for our sins. Through his mediation of the new covenant, we are saved. And that is true for us just as much as it was true for Abraham or Moses or any of the Old Testament saints. So I think the logic of White's argument demands it, and I think it's just something he didn't consider. But I hope he or others can take another look at that and reconsider it. Thank you.